June 1940. In just 6 weeks, the army that had once been considered the strongest in Europe lay shattered. The stunning collapse of France sent shockwaves across the world. German armored divisions had sliced through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line, and encircled Allied forces with a speed that even seasoned commanders found astonishing. Paris fell on June 14. 8 days later, France signed an armistice. To many in Berlin, the war in the West already felt finished. Inside the German High Command, confidence bordered on disbelief. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, recorded in his diary his sense that Britain now stood alone and exposed. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks, Norway in months, and France in record time. What rational government, they asked, would continue fighting under such circumstances? At the center of this confidence stood Adolf Hitler. He had long admired the British Empire. Unlike his hatred for what he called Bolshevism in the East, he saw Britain as a potential partner, a fellow imperial power that could coexist with a German-dominated Europe. After France fell, Hitler did not immediately push for invasion plans. Instead, he expected negotiation. On July 19, 1940, in a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler publicly extended what he described as a reasonable offer of peace to Britain. He framed it as a generous gesture from a victorious power. In his mind, Britain had no viable military option left. Its army had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Its European allies were defeated. Its continent was now dominated by Germany, from the Pyrenees to the Polish frontier. But in Berlin's military circles, the assumption went even deeper than public speeches. Senior officers genuinely believed Britain's strategic position was hopeless. The Wehrmacht controlled Western Europe's coastline. German U-boats were tightening their grip on Atlantic shipping lanes. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the Royal Air Force on paper. And with France defeated, Britain had lost its primary continental base of operations. General Alfred Jodl reportedly described Britain's situation as militarily untenable. Others echoed the view that London's leadership would soon recognize reality. There was a widespread belief that the British ruling class, pragmatic, empire-minded, and cautious, would prefer compromise over destruction. What German commanders failed to grasp was that they were projecting their own strategic logic onto an entirely different political culture. They assumed Britain would calculate survival in purely military terms, but they misunderstood the power of national resolve, especially under a new and unyielding Prime Minister, Churchill. Churchill had taken office only in May 1940, at Britain's darkest hour. Many in Germany believed he was a temporary figure, an emotional orator who would soon be replaced by someone more willing to negotiate. They were unaware of how deeply his speeches had already galvanized the British public. His promise to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, and in the streets was not rhetorical flourish, it was a declaration of intent. Meanwhile, German intelligence assessments consistently underestimated British morale. Reports filtered back to Berlin suggesting political divisions in London, war fatigue, and a desire for settlement. There were indeed voices within the British establishment who favored exploring peace, but German leaders misjudged how decisively Churchill had consolidated control. In private, Halder's diary entries reveal a mixture of optimism and impatience. The army leadership did not immediately begin preparing for a cross-channel invasion because they believed it would not be necessary. Operation Sea Lion, the eventual invasion plan, was at first little more than a contingency. The expectation remained that Britain would come to terms before such drastic measures were required. Even within the Kriegsmarine, concerns about naval inferiority were temporarily overshadowed by the assumption that diplomacy would solve the problem. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder knew that Germany lacked sufficient landing craft and could not match the Royal Navy ship for ship, yet the belief persisted that these weaknesses would never be tested. There was also a psychological factor at play. The speed of German victories had created a sense of inevitability. Blitzkrieg had worked everywhere. Why would it fail now? The Wehrmacht's officer corps had witnessed political leaders crumble before military pressure in Poland, in Norway, in Belgium, and in France. Each time, resistance had seemed strong until it suddenly collapsed. From Berlin's perspective, Britain's refusal to negotiate looked temporary, almost theatrical. Surely, once the shock wore off, London would see reason. But behind this confidence lay a critical miscalculation. Germany had achieved operational brilliance on land, yet it had not broken Britain's core strength, its navy, its empire, and its access to global resources. While Europe had fallen, Britain's fleet still ruled the seas, its industrial capacity remained intact, and its empire stretched across continents. Hitler's expectation of peace was not entirely irrational. It was shaped by his worldview. He believed wars were ultimately decided by decisive blows and political will. He had delivered the blow to France. He assumed Britain's will would follow. Instead, silence came from London. No delegation arrived. No secret surrender terms were accepted. Churchill did not waver. In the corridors of the German High Command, uncertainty slowly began to replace triumph. The question shifted from "when will Britain surrender" to "what if it does not?" That subtle shift marked a turning point. For the first time since 1939, Germany faced an opponent who refused to behave predictably, an opponent who chose defiance over pragmatism, an island nation that would not calculate survival in the way Berlin expected. In June and July 1940, the German generals believed they were witnessing the final act of the Western War. Instead, they were standing at the beginning of a far longer and far more dangerous conflict, one that would expand beyond Europe and ultimately engulf the world. The illusion of inevitable British surrender was not shattered in a single dramatic moment. It eroded gradually, quietly, as days passed without negotiation, and with each passing day, the realization grew more uncomfortable. Britain was not beaten, and this war was not over. Late June 1940. France had fallen. The German army stood victorious along the Atlantic coast, from Norway to the Spanish border. In Berlin, celebrations still lingered in the air. Yet beneath the triumph, a growing irritation began to surface. Britain had not asked for peace. At first, the silence from London was interpreted as delay. Surely reason would prevail. Surely the British government understood that it now stood alone against a continental empire stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. But as days turned into weeks, the tone inside the German High Command began to change. On July 3, 1940, Britain sent an unmistakable signal. In a dramatic and controversial move, the Royal Navy attacked elements of the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in North Africa to prevent the ships from falling into German hands. Nearly 1,300 French sailors were killed. To Berlin, the message was clear. Britain was not preparing to surrender. It was preparing to fight on at any cost. Within the Wehrmacht's leadership, confusion replaced certainty. General Franz Halder noted in his diary that Britain's position appeared hopeless, yet its political leadership showed no sign of compromise. How could a nation so strategically exposed act with such defiance? At the center of their frustration stood Winston Churchill. German intelligence reports had initially described him as erratic and politically vulnerable. Some in Berlin believed he would be replaced by figures more inclined toward negotiation. Instead, Churchill consolidated power. His speeches grew more defiant, not less. His language was uncompromising. There would be no peace talks with Adolf Hitler. Hitler himself seemed genuinely puzzled. He had never intended to destroy the British Empire. In his worldview, Germany and Britain were natural partners, racial kin, imperial powers with global ambitions. His war, as he often framed it, was against France's resistance and against Bolshevism in the East. Britain's continued resistance disrupted that vision. In private meetings, Hitler expressed disbelief that London would reject what he saw as a generous settlement. He was offering recognition of the British Empire in exchange for accepting German dominance on the continent. From his perspective, this was pragmatic geopolitics. But to Churchill's government, any negotiated peace under those terms would legitimize German control of Europe and leave Britain permanently vulnerable. Berlin underestimated how deeply this fear ran through British leadership. Inside the German military command structure, debates intensified. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl reassured Hitler that Britain's resistance could not last indefinitely. The Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring promised that air power alone would force Britain to the negotiating table. Yet not all were convinced. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the Kriegsmarine, understood the imbalance at sea. The Royal Navy remained the largest and most powerful fleet in the world. Germany's surface fleet was small, its U-boat force expanding but not yet decisive. If Britain chose to fight a long maritime war, Germany faced serious limitations. Halder's diary entries during July 1940 reveal uncertainty creeping into the highest levels of command. Intelligence assessments were inconsistent. Some reports suggested British morale was crumbling under the threat of invasion. Others indicated that Churchill's leadership had unified public opinion. The problem for Berlin was that its intelligence network in Britain was weak. Many German agents had been captured or turned. Assumptions replaced verified information. German leaders relied heavily on logic, and logic told them Britain should not continue. But Britain was not operating on Berlin's logic. On July 19th, Hitler made his public appeal for peace before the Reichstag. He portrayed himself as a statesman extending a final offer. The speech was carefully calculated. It was meant to appear magnanimous, almost reluctant. He implied that further bloodshed would be Britain's responsibility. The response from London was silence, followed by continued military mobilization. Churchill dismissed the speech as empty propaganda. Behind closed doors, British war preparations accelerated. Radar stations expanded coverage, fighter production increased, coastal defenses strengthened. The British government was not looking for terms, it was bracing for assault. For the German generals, this refusal created a strategic dilemma. Blitzkrieg had been designed for rapid, decisive campaigns on land. It relied on speed, surprise, and concentrated force. But Britain could not be reached by panzer divisions. The English Channel was not the Ardennes. It was a natural barrier defended by the world's most powerful navy. The realization began to settle in. Germany had not prepared for this scenario. The Wehrmacht had mastered continental warfare. It had not mastered amphibious invasion. It lacked specialized landing craft. It lacked naval superiority, and it lacked experience in cross-channel operations. If Britain refused to negotiate, Germany would be forced into a kind of war it had never intended to fight. Within Hitler's inner circle, impatience grew. He oscillated between confidence and irritation. At times, he predicted Britain would collapse under air bombardment. At other moments, he speculated that Churchill was being manipulated by forces hoping to draw the United States into the war. That suspicion added another layer of urgency. If Britain held out long enough, American material support might increase. Germany's window for decisive action could close. The psychological shift inside the high command was subtle but significant. In June, Britain's surrender seemed inevitable. By late July, it was no longer certain. The question was no longer whether Britain would negotiate, but how Germany would force it to. For the first time since the war began, Germany faced strategic ambiguity. Poland had fallen quickly, Norway had been secured, France had collapsed with stunning speed, but Britain was different. It was defiant, insulated by geography, sustained by empire, and led by a man who refused compromise. The German generals were caught between their earlier confidence and an uncomfortable new reality. Their lightning war had conquered the continent, yet it had not broken their last Western enemy. And as summer 1940 advanced, one fact became impossible to ignore. Britain was not seeking peace. It was preparing for battle. By mid-July 1940, the tone inside Berlin had shifted from expectation to calculation. Britain had refused peace. That left only one alternative: invasion. The code name came quickly: Operation Sea Lion. On paper, it sounded decisive, almost inevitable. Cross the English Channel, land on Britain's southern coast, seize a port, drive inland toward London, and force capitulation. It was a plan that fit Germany's recent pattern of bold, rapid offensives. But beneath the surface, many of Germany's most senior commanders knew something uncomfortable. This was nothing like Poland, nothing like France. The German army had perfected lightning war across land borders. Now it faced a 21-mile stretch of water, the English Channel, controlled by the most powerful navy in the world. The Wehrmacht had no tradition of large-scale amphibious operations. It had no fleet of specialized landing craft. It had no guarantee of air supremacy. And without those elements, invasion meant catastrophe. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder of the Kriegsmarine was among the first to voice caution. Germany's surface fleet had suffered losses during the Norwegian campaign. Several major ships were damaged or sunk. The Royal Navy could deploy battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of smaller vessels to intercept any crossing attempt. Raeder warned that unless the Luftwaffe first destroyed the Royal Air Force and neutralized British naval power, Sea Lion would be suicidal. His assessments were not dramatic, they were coldly technical. Germany simply did not possess the naval strength required for a secure crossing. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised that air power alone would solve the problem. He assured Adolf Hitler that the RAF could be crushed in weeks. Once British skies were cleared, he argued, the Royal Navy would not dare approach the Channel under constant air attack. But the army, however, remained skeptical. General Franz Halder's diary entries from late July and August 1940 revealed a sense of unease. He noted the lack of preparation, the shortage of transport vessels, and the improvised nature of the planning. River barges from across Europe were being collected and modified for sea travel. These flat-bottomed boats were never designed for open water, let alone contested crossings under fire. Even senior army officers privately questioned whether such vessels could survive unpredictable Channel weather or British naval guns. The operational plan itself was ambitious. German forces would land along a broad front between Folkestone and Brighton. Initial waves would secure beachheads, followed by reinforcement divisions pushing inland. Within days, the Wehrmacht hoped to isolate London and sever British command structures. But every stage depended on one condition: total air superiority. Without it, German barges would be exposed to RAF attacks. Without it, British destroyers could tear through invasion convoys at night. Without it, the crossing could turn into a massacre. Hitler's own attitude towards Sea Lion was complex. Contrary to later myths, he was not obsessed with invading Britain at any cost. He preferred Britain as a neutral partner rather than a conquered enemy. The invasion order, Directive No. 16, was issued with clear preconditions. If the Luftwaffe failed to eliminate British air resistance, the invasion would not proceed. This conditional nature revealed uncertainty at the highest level. Within the high command, discussions became increasingly tense. Time was a factor. Weather conditions in the Channel would worsen by autumn. Preparations needed weeks. Coordination between Army, Navy, and Air Force was fragile at best. Germany's military branches operated with overlapping authority and rivalry rather than seamless integration. The Wehrmacht feared annihilation. The army feared logistical chaos. The Luftwaffe projected confidence. As August approached, planning intensified. Detailed maps of southern England were studied. Intelligence officers compiled estimates of British troop strength. German propaganda units began producing leaflets designed for occupation scenarios. Yet beneath the outward momentum, doubt persisted. Halder privately questioned whether the operation was being driven more by political necessity than military logic. If Britain could not be bombed into submission quickly, Germany faced a dilemma: commit to a risky invasion or accept a prolonged air and naval war for which it was not fully prepared. There was also the larger strategic question, the East. Even as Sea Lion planning advanced, Hitler's long-term vision remained focused on the Soviet Union. Some generals suspected that Britain's continued resistance was indirectly linked to hopes of German conflict with Moscow. If Germany turned east, Britain might survive long enough for new alliances to form. That possibility added urgency, but also hesitation. The more detailed Sea Lion became, the clearer its vulnerabilities appeared. Germany had mastered speed and shock on land, but amphibious warfare required patience, coordination, and naval dominance, qualities it did not possess in sufficient measure. In private conversations, some officers began to acknowledge a reality that would have been unthinkable in June. Britain might not be forced into surrender at all. The invasion plan, once imagined as a swift final blow, began to resemble a gamble. And unlike the campaigns in Poland or France, this gamble offered no guarantee of lightning victory. It offered risk, immense risk, against an enemy who had already demonstrated an unexpected willingness to endure. Operation Sea Lion was born not from overwhelming strength, but from strategic frustration. Germany's military elite had believed Britain would negotiate. When it did not, they turned to invasion. But as preparations unfolded, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Crossing the Channel would not be another blitzkrieg. It would be a test Germany had never prepared to take. In August 1940, the skies over southern England became the decisive battlefield of Europe. Operation Sea Lion could not proceed without one essential condition: the destruction of the Royal Air Force. If Germany could not control the air, it could not cross the Channel. Everything now depended on the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring had assured Adolf Hitler that the RAF would collapse within weeks. On paper, the Luftwaffe looked unstoppable, battle-hardened from Poland and France, equipped with modern aircraft, commanded by confident veterans of blitzkrieg. German pilots believed they were about to deliver the final blow that would force Britain to the negotiating table. The campaign began with attacks on coastal shipping and radar stations. Then came large-scale assaults on RAF airfields in southern England. The goal was simple: destroy British fighter strength on the ground and in the air. At first, German reports were optimistic. Luftwaffe commanders claimed heavy British losses. They believed the RAF was nearing exhaustion. Intelligence estimates suggested Britain had far fewer operational fighters than it actually did. The assumption inside Berlin was that British resistance was on the brink of collapse. But those assessments were wrong. Britain's radar system, an integrated network of early warning stations, allowed RAF Fighter Command to detect incoming raids with remarkable efficiency. Instead of scrambling blindly, British squadrons were directed precisely where needed. German planners had underestimated both the technology and the coordination behind it. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's defensive system was not flashy, but it was disciplined and organized. German bombers often found themselves intercepted by determined British fighters who seemed to appear exactly at the right moment. Inside the German High Command, frustration began to grow. Losses mounted. German aircraft were being shot down at rates higher than anticipated. Pilots who survived spoke of intense resistance and surprisingly resilient British defenses, yet Göring continued to promise imminent victory. General Franz Halder's diary entries from August revealed growing impatience. The army was waiting, Sea Lion could not proceed without air superiority, and that superiority was proving elusive. Then came a critical turning point. In late August, German bombs fell on London, initially by accident during night raids. In response, Britain bombed Berlin. The attack caused minimal physical damage, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. For the first time, the German capital had been struck. Hitler was furious. The Luftwaffe's strategy shifted. Instead of focusing primarily on RAF airfields and infrastructure, German bombers began targeting London and other major cities in sustained bombing campaigns. The objective expanded from military destruction to psychological pressure. The Blitz had begun. From Berlin's perspective, bombing London would break civilian morale and force British government to reconsider peace. The assumption remained that Britain's endurance had limits. But strategically, the shift carried consequences. Relieved from relentless attacks on its airfields, RAF Fighter Command gained critical breathing space. Damaged runways were repaired. Aircraft production continued at impressive speed. Pilots, though exhausted, held the line. German commanders began to sense something was wrong. Despite weeks of bombing, Britain showed no signs of surrender. Civilian morale did not collapse. In fact, reports suggested that the bombings were strengthening British resolve. Inside the Luftwaffe, tensions surfaced. Some officers privately questioned the change in strategy. Destroying airfields had been producing measurable results. Bombing cities was dramatic, but it did not eliminate British fighters. The longer the battle continued, the clearer it became. The RAF was not defeated. By mid-September, German losses were becoming unsustainable. On September 15th, a massive daylight raid was met with fierce resistance. Dozens of German aircraft were shot down. British propaganda later celebrated it as a defining moment, but even within German command circles, the scale of resistance was undeniable. Reports reaching Hitler became more cautious. Goering's earlier confidence gave way to defensive explanations. Weather conditions were blamed. Aircraft range limitations were cited. Fighter escort challenges were acknowledged. The core reality, however, was unavoidable. Germany had failed to achieve air superiority. Without control of the skies, Operation Sea Lion was impossible. German barges assembled along the Channel coast remained idle. The army waited for an order that would never come. By late September 1940, the invasion was effectively postponed indefinitely. The Luftwaffe shifted increasingly towards night bombing raids. The idea of a swift knockout blow faded. Inside the German High Command, the psychological shift was profound. For the first time in the war, a major German offensive had failed to achieve its objective. Poland had collapsed, France had fallen, but Britain had endured. The myth of unstoppable blitzkrieg had encountered its limits, not on land, but in the air. German generals began reassessing assumptions that seemed unshakable only months earlier. Britain was not a weakened remnant waiting to surrender. It was an active, adaptive opponent capable of sustained resistance. The Battle of Britain did not end with a dramatic declaration. It ended gradually as momentum slipped away from Germany. And with that loss of momentum came a realization that would shape the next phase of the war. If Britain could not be defeated quickly, the conflict would stretch far beyond what Berlin had originally planned. The lightning war had met the storm, and the storm had held. By October 1940, it was no longer a question of when Britain would surrender. The question had quietly transformed into something far more troubling for Berlin. What now? Operation Sea Lion was never formally announced as canceled, but in reality it was shelved. The invasion barges remained in port. Troops originally earmarked for the assault were reassigned. The window of favorable weather closed as autumn storms swept across the Channel. Germany had failed to secure air superiority, and without it, crossing into Britain meant disaster. Inside the German High Command, the mood shifted from anticipation to strategic recalculation. Adolf Hitler had built his early victories on speed and surprise. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in 6. Each campaign reinforced the belief that bold, concentrated force could break any opponent before a long war became necessary. Britain's survival shattered that rhythm. For Hitler, Britain's refusal to collapse was both frustrating and perplexing. He had never truly intended to annihilate the British Empire. In his worldview, Britain was a potential partner, a fellow imperial power that would eventually recognize German dominance on the continent. He believed reason would prevail. Instead, Britain endured the Blitz, absorbed the bombings, and continued fighting. German intelligence began reassessing Britain's strength. The Royal Navy remained intact. Its global empire provided manpower, raw materials, and strategic depth. Convoys, though threatened by U-boats, continued crossing the Atlantic. Even more concerning, signs of increasing American support were becoming visible. Though the United States was not yet formally in the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration was steadily moving toward greater assistance for Britain. Economic aid, military supplies, and political sympathy flowed west to east across the Atlantic. Germany recognized the danger. If Britain survived long enough, it might not stand alone forever. This realization carried enormous strategic consequences. In November and December 1940, Hitler's attention increasingly turned eastward. For years, his long-term vision had centered on expansion into Soviet territory. The defeat of France had created an opportunity, but Britain's survival complicated everything. As long as Britain remained in the war, Germany faced the risk of a two-front conflict if it attacked the Soviet Union. Yet Hitler drew a different conclusion. He began to believe that Britain's continued resistance was based on hope that the Soviet Union or the United States would eventually intervene decisively. In his mind, destroying the Soviet Union would eliminate that hope. Once Moscow fell, Britain would realize its position was hopeless and finally negotiate. It was a critical miscalculation. Inside the Wehrmacht, reactions were mixed. Some generals welcomed the shift eastward. They saw the Soviet Union as the ideological and strategic enemy from the beginning. Others understood the risks. With Britain undefeated, opening a massive campaign in the east meant gambling everything on a swift victory. General Franz Halder's diary entries during late 1940 reflect both ambition and apprehension. Planning for what would become Operation Barbarossa accelerated. Divisions were redeployed from Western Europe towards Poland. Resources were redirected. The war that had begun as a series of rapid Western campaigns was about to transform into something far larger. Britain's refusal to surrender had forced Germany into a strategic crossroads. If Britain had made peace in the summer of 1940, Germany could have consolidated control of Western Europe, strengthened its navy and air force, and prepared methodically for future operations. Instead, the war remained active on multiple fronts, in the Atlantic, in the skies over Britain, in North Africa, and soon across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. The psychological impact on German leadership was subtle but significant. The aura of inevitability that surrounded early blitzkrieg victories had been broken. Germany was still dominant, it still controlled most of Europe, but it was no longer unstoppable. For the first time, the war's timeline was uncertain. Britain's endurance carried symbolic weight far beyond its shores. It became a rallying point for resistance movements across occupied Europe. It provided a base for intelligence operations, bombing campaigns, and future Allied planning. It proved that Nazi Germany could be resisted and survived. Within Berlin's military elite, a sobering realization took hold. This conflict would not end quickly. The decision to pivot eastward in 1941 was not simply ideological, it was shaped by the failure to force Britain out of the war. Germany had sought a decisive Western conclusion. Instead, it faced a prolonged global struggle. When German generals reflected privately on the summer of 1940, some acknowledged the misjudgment. They had underestimated British political will. They had assumed rational calculation would lead to compromise. They had mistaken geographical isolation for strategic weakness. They had expected surrender. What they encountered instead was endurance. And that endurance reshaped the war. By surviving the summer of 1940, Britain ensured that Germany would never fight on a single front. It ensured that the conflict would expand, drawing in the Soviet Union, the United States, and ultimately much of the world. The moment Britain refused to surrender was not just a diplomatic decision, it was a strategic turning point. In the quiet corridors of Berlin, as plans shifted eastward and invasion barges gathered dust, one truth became unavoidable. The Lightning War had failed to deliver final victory, and the war Germany now faced would be longer, broader, and far more devastating than its leaders had ever imagined.